If you give to a church in America, there's a high chance you would be shocked by where your money actually goes. In 2022, a megachurch in Georgia published its annual budget for the first time in 15 years. The congregation of 8,000 had contributed $23 million the previous year. Members expected to see the breakdown: missions, salaries, building maintenance, community outreach. What they found instead shocked them. 42% of the budget, nearly $10 million, went to staff salaries and benefits. Another 18% went to building debt service. 12% went to facilities and operations. Marketing and media production consumed 8%. When members added it up, they discovered that less than 11% of their donations went to anything that could be called ministry outside the church walls. Missions received 4%. Benevolence and community outreach received 3%. The rest disappeared into the machinery of running the institution itself. Within 6 months, giving dropped by 30%. Hundreds of members left. The church was forced to make significant cuts, and the question that had been whispered in parking lots and small groups for years finally became unavoidable. Where does the money actually go? This church was not unique. Across the United States, churches collect approximately $100 billion annually from their members. That is more than the GDP of many countries, more than the annual budgets of most Fortune 500 companies. It represents the single largest voluntary wealth transfer in American society. And yet, in most churches, members have almost no visibility into how that money is spent. The veil of financial secrecy in American churches is so complete that most denominational structures do not require congregations to publish budgets. Most churches do not provide itemized financial reports to their members. Most pastors resist transparency about their own compensation. And when churches do collapse under financial scandal or mismanagement, the warning signs were almost always visible to leadership long before they became visible to congregations, but were carefully concealed. A 2021 study by the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability found that only 38% of evangelical churches provide their members with detailed annual financial statements. 62% provide only summary information or no financial information at all. Among non-denominational churches, the number is even worse. Fewer than 25% provide detailed budgets to their congregations. Most donors are not wealthy. They are teachers, nurses, retirees, giving faithfully, assuming their sacrifice matters. The consequences of this opacity are profound. Churches accumulate debt they cannot service. Pastors receive compensation packages that would shock their congregations. Building projects proceed without adequate financial planning. And members donate faithfully, trusting that their money is being used wisely, never knowing that in many cases it is not. The question is not whether churches misuse funds intentionally. Most do not. The question is whether the current system of financial secrecy, minimal accountability, and congregational ignorance serves the church well. And the evidence increasingly suggests that it does not. What members assume about church finances and what actually happens with their donations are often two very different things. And the gap between assumption and reality is where disillusionment, distrust, and decline take root. Following the Money reveals uncomfortable truths about American Christianity, about what churches actually value, about how institutions prioritize self-preservation over mission, and about how financial opacity enables dysfunction that would not survive transparency. The megachurch in Georgia was not an outlier. It was typical, and that is the crisis. The problem begins with expectations. When members donate to their church, they operate on assumptions about how the money will be used. They assume most of it will fund ministry, missions, outreach, benevolence, programs that help people and spread the gospel. They assume pastoral salaries are reasonable and appropriate. They assume the church operates efficiently, without waste or excess. They assume financial decisions are made wisely and transparently. These assumptions are rarely tested because most churches provide no mechanism for members to verify them. The typical church member receives a giving statement at year's end showing their donations for tax purposes. They may hear occasional updates from the pulpit about building campaigns or missions offerings. They may see a one-page budget summary in an annual meeting, but they almost never see the full picture of church finances. This opacity is not accidental, it is structural, and it serves the interests of church leadership more than it serves the interests of congregations. When researchers analyze church budgets using the minority of churches that actually publish detailed financial statements, consistent patterns emerge. These patterns reveal where church money actually goes, and the picture is sobering. Personnel costs typically consume 50 to 60% of church budgets. This includes not just pastoral salaries, but benefits, retirement contributions, health insurance, housing allowances, continuing education, and staff expenses. In larger churches with multiple staff members, this percentage can reach 70% or higher. A megachurch with 50 staff members may spend $15 to $20 million annually on personnel alone. This is not necessarily inappropriate. Ministry requires people, and people require compensation. But the scale often surprises congregations when they finally see the numbers. A church with a $10 million budget may spend $6 million on staff. Members who assumed their donations were funding missions or ministry programs discover that the majority is simply paying salaries. Facility costs consume another 15 to 25% of most church budgets. This includes mortgage payments or building debt service, utilities, maintenance, repairs, insurance, and upgrades. Churches with significant debt loads may spend 30% or more on facility costs. A church that built a $10 million facility with a 20-year mortgage may be paying $500,000 to $800,000 annually just in debt service, before accounting for utilities, maintenance, or insurance. The problem intensifies when churches build beyond their means. The gleaming new sanctuary that seats 2,000 looks impressive, but if the congregation averages 800 in attendance, the building becomes a financial albatross. One pastor in North Carolina described it this way: "We built a $3 million facility when our annual budget was $1.2 million. We thought we would grow into it. We didn't. Now we spend $400,000 a year just servicing the debt. That's a third of our budget. We can't afford to hire youth pastors or children's ministers because we're paying for a building we don't need." Operations and administration consume another 10 to 15% of church budgets. This includes office supplies, technology, software subscriptions, communications, legal fees, accounting, insurance, and general administrative overhead. In an era of multimedia church services, this category has expanded dramatically. Churches now pay for video production equipment, streaming services, website hosting, social media management, graphic design software, and technical staff to run it all. The cost of maintaining a contemporary church presence is staggering. One megachurch in Texas reported spending $800,000 annually on media production, cameras, lighting, editing software, streaming infrastructure, and technical staff. Another church in Arizona spent $300,000 redesigning its website and implementing a church management software system. These costs are invisible to most members but consume significant portions of church budgets. Marketing and advertising have become major expense categories for churches attempting to grow. Churches spend tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars on billboard advertising, direct mail campaigns, social media ads, radio spots, and promotional materials. One church in Florida spent $120,000 on a single Easter advertising campaign. The campaign generated approximately 200 first-time visitors, 40 of whom returned for a second visit. The cost per new attender was $3,000. The campaign was considered a success by church leadership. Members who donated to the church never knew that their money was being spent this way because the budget line simply read, "Outreach and Communications." Would you still give if this was printed on a Sunday bulletin? Ministry programs, the activities that most members assume consume the majority of church resources, typically receive only 10 to 20% of church budgets. This includes children's ministry, youth ministry, adult education, small groups, discipleship programs, and pastoral care. In smaller churches, this percentage may be higher. In larger churches with significant overhead costs, it may be lower. Missions and benevolence, the outward-facing ministry that many members prioritize when deciding where to donate, typically receive 5 to 15% of church budgets. Some churches dedicate a larger percentage, particularly those with strong missions traditions. But many churches, especially larger ones with high operational costs, struggle to allocate even 10% to missions and outreach. The result is a distribution of resources that would shock most church members if they saw it clearly. The majority of their donations go to maintaining the institution, paying staff, servicing building debt, covering operational costs, and funding internal programs. Less than 20%, and sometimes less than 10%, goes to ministry beyond the church walls. The irony is profound. Jesus commanded his followers to go into the world, to care for the poor, to make disciples of all nations. But the average American church spends 80 to 90% of its resources on itself. This is where many churches stop being ministries and start being machines. At this point, most church members stop asking questions because the answers are uncomfortable. This is not unique to megachurches. Small churches face the same dynamics, often in more acute form. A rural church with 75 members and a $150,000 annual budget may spend $60,000 on their pastor's salary, $40,000 on building costs, $20,000 on utilities and operations, and $30,000 on everything else. Missions may receive $5,000. Benevolence may receive $2,000. The remaining $23,000 covers ministry programs, supplies, and denominational contributions. Members of such churches often assume their pastor is underpaid and their building is barely maintained, so they donate sacrificially. What they do not realize is that the financial structure itself is unsustainable. The church cannot afford a full-time pastor and a building with its current attendance. But rather than acknowledging this reality, the church continues operating at a deficit or depleting reserves, hoping that growth will eventually solve the problem. The human cost of this financial dysfunction is immense. Churches accumulate debt they cannot repay. Pastors receive inadequate compensation or, conversely, compensation so generous it would embarrass them if members knew. Building projects proceed without adequate financial planning, burdening congregations with decades of debt. Ministry programs are chronically underfunded because operational costs consume everything. And members who give faithfully and sacrificially have no idea where their money actually goes. The problem is compounded by pastoral compensation, which remains one of the most opaque aspects of church finances. Most churches do not disclose pastoral salaries to their congregations. The information is typically known only to a small group of elders or board members who make compensation decisions behind closed doors. This secrecy creates problems in both directions. In some churches, pastors are genuinely underpaid, struggling to support their families on inadequate salaries while working 60-hour weeks. Members assume their pastor is compensated fairly and do not understand why he seems stressed or is forced to take a second job. In other churches, particularly larger ones, pastors receive compensation packages that would shock their congregations. A megachurch pastor may receive a salary of $300,000 plus housing allowance, retirement contributions, health insurance, life insurance, disability insurance, continuing education allowance, book allowance, travel expenses, and use of church-owned vehicles. The total compensation package may exceed $500,000 annually. Members who tithe faithfully on $40,000 salaries have no idea that their pastor's compensation is more than 10 times their own. The justification for such compensation is typically that megachurch pastors function as CEOs of large organizations and should be compensated accordingly. This argument has merit in purely economic terms. But it also represents a fundamental shift in how the church understands pastoral ministry. Is a pastor a shepherd who serves the flock, or is he a CEO who runs an organization? The answer to that question has profound theological and practical implications. The secrecy around pastoral compensation also enables abuse. Pastors who control their own salaries or serve on boards that determine their compensation face obvious conflicts of interest. In churches without adequate financial oversight, pastors have been known to approve their own raises, award themselves bonuses, or structure compensation in ways that minimize taxes but maximize personal benefit. One megachurch pastor in the Midwest structured his compensation to include a $400,000 housing allowance, which is exempt from federal income tax for ministers. He used the allowance to purchase a $3 million home, which the church then claimed as a parsonage, despite the fact that the pastor owned it personally. When the arrangement was eventually discovered and reported by local media, the congregation was shocked. The pastor defended the arrangement as legal, which it was. Nothing here is illegal, that's the problem. Financial secrecy also enables misuse of funds, even when no laws are broken. Churches spend money on projects that benefit leadership more than congregation. They approve expenditures that serve institutional interests rather than ministry priorities. And they make decisions that members would question or oppose if they had visibility into the process. One church in Pennsylvania spent $80,000 remodeling the senior pastor's office, including custom woodwork, leather furniture, and high-end technology. The project was approved by the elder board without congregational input. Members learned about it only when a construction invoice was accidentally included in documents distributed at an annual meeting. The pastor defended the expenditure as necessary for hosting donors and conducting important meetings. Members saw it as waste and indulgence. Giving declined, and the pastor eventually resigned. Another church in California purchased a vacation property described as a ministry retreat center. The property was used occasionally for staff retreats and elder meetings, but it was also used extensively by the senior pastor and his family for personal vacations. The church paid for maintenance, utilities, and property taxes. When members eventually learned about the arrangement, they were outraged. The property was sold, but the damage to trust was irreparable. These cases are not rare exceptions. They are predictable outcomes of a system that prioritizes institutional secrecy over congregational transparency. When financial decisions are made behind closed doors, when pastors control information about their own compensation, when churches operate without meaningful accountability, dysfunction and abuse are inevitable. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed many of these dynamics in dramatic fashion. Churches that had appeared financially healthy suddenly faced crisis. Giving dropped as members lost jobs or faced financial uncertainty. Churches with significant debt loads and high operational costs could not adjust quickly enough. Staff were laid off, programs were cut, some churches closed entirely. But the pandemic also revealed which churches had been operating responsibly and which had been living beyond their means. Churches with minimal debt, adequate reserves, and transparent finances weathered the storm relatively well. Churches that had built elaborate facilities, hired large staffs, and relied on ever-increasing giving to cover expenses faced catastrophic problems. One megachurch in Virginia that had built a $50 million facility just 3 years before the pandemic was forced to declare bankruptcy in 2021. The church had been carrying $4 million in annual debt service, which required consistent growth in giving to sustain. When the pandemic hit and giving declined, the church could not make its payments. The facility was sold to a private developer. The congregation fractured, and members who had donated sacrificially to build the facility discovered that their investment had been lost. The tragedy was that the warning signs had been visible for years. Financial reports, the limited information that was made available to members, showed declining reserves and increasing reliance on credit. But members were assured that everything was fine, that the church was managing its obligations, that God would provide. When the collapse came, it was sudden and devastating, but it should not have been surprising. The financial opacity that characterizes American churches represents one of the most significant threats to institutional credibility and long-term sustainability. Churches operate with less financial accountability than virtually any other organization in American society, and the consequences are becoming impossible to ignore. The result is a system that incentivizes institutional self-preservation over mission, that enables abuse and mismanagement, and that erodes trust between leadership and congregations. Members give faithfully, but they have no assurance that their donations are being used wisely or appropriately. And when scandals emerge, as they inevitably do, the damage extends far beyond the individual church involved. The problem is structural, not merely personal. It is not primarily about bad pastors or corrupt leaders, though those exist. It is about a system that concentrates financial control in the hands of a few, provides minimal transparency to members, and operates with virtually no external accountability. Consider the contrast with nonprofit organizations. A nonprofit that receives significant donations must file Form 990 with the IRS, which discloses detailed financial information including revenue, expenses, assets, liabilities, and compensation for key employees. This information is publicly available. Donors can review it before deciding whether to give. Watchdog organizations like Charity Navigator and GuideStar evaluate nonprofits based on financial health, transparency, and effectiveness. Churches are exempt from these requirements. They do not file Form 990. They do not disclose compensation information. They face no requirement to publish budgets or financial statements, and they operate with minimal oversight even from their own members. This exemption made sense when churches were small, local organizations led by modestly compensated pastors who lived among their congregations. But it makes no sense in an era of megachurches with $100 million budgets, celebrity pastors with multi-million-dollar compensation packages, and sprawling ministry empires that function more like corporations than congregations. The lack of accountability has predictable consequences. Churches spend money in ways that serve institutional interests rather than ministry priorities. Leaders approve their own compensation without meaningful oversight. Building projects proceed without adequate financial planning, and when problems emerge, they are concealed rather than addressed. The human cost is immense. Members who donate sacrificially discover that their money was wasted or misused. Churches collapse under debt loads that should never have been approved. Pastors burn out trying to sustain institutions that are fundamentally unsustainable. And the credibility of Christianity itself suffers when financial scandals become public. The solution is not complicated, but it is threatening to church leaders who benefit from the current system. It requires transparency. Churches should publish detailed annual budgets showing exactly where money comes from and where it goes. They should disclose pastoral compensation and benefits. They should maintain adequate reserves and avoid debt that requires perpetual growth to sustain. And they should submit to external audits and accountability. Some churches already do this. They publish detailed financial statements, they disclose pastoral salaries, they operate with balanced budgets and adequate reserves, they make financial decisions with congregational input, and members of these churches report higher levels of trust, greater willingness to give, and stronger connection to the church's mission. But these churches are the exception, not the norm. Most American churches continue to operate with minimal transparency, trusting that members will continue giving without asking difficult questions. That trust is eroding. Younger generations are less willing to donate to organizations that do not demonstrate financial accountability. They want to know where their money goes, how it is used, and whether it is making a difference. Churches that refuse to provide this information are losing credibility with precisely the demographic they need to reach. The financial model that sustained American churches for decades is collapsing. Giving is declining, attendance is dropping, and members are asking harder questions about where their money goes. Churches that continue to operate with financial secrecy will find themselves increasingly unable to attract or retain members who expect basic accountability. The irony is profound. Churches teach their members to be good stewards of their personal finances, to budget carefully, avoid debt, save wisely, and give generously. But many churches do not practice what they preach. They accumulate debt. They spend beyond their means. They make financial decisions without transparency. And they expect members to continue giving without question. This hypocrisy is unsustainable. Members are increasingly unwilling to donate to institutions that do not demonstrate the same financial discipline they are taught to practice in their own lives. The warning for American Christianity is clear. Financial opacity is not protecting the church, it is undermining it. The assumption that members will give faithfully without demanding accountability is proving false. The trust that once enabled churches to operate with minimal transparency is eroding, and the financial dysfunction that secrecy enables is becoming impossible to conceal. Churches have a choice. They can embrace transparency, demonstrate accountability, and rebuild trust with their members. Or they can continue operating in secrecy, hoping that members will not ask difficult questions until the financial dysfunction becomes so severe that the institution collapses. The evidence suggests that many churches will choose the latter. They will resist transparency because it threatens comfortable arrangements. They will defend secrecy as protecting privacy or maintaining authority. And they will continue operating without accountability until crisis forces change. But some churches will choose differently. They will recognize that transparency is not a threat, but an opportunity. They will understand that accountability strengthens rather than weakens leadership. And they will demonstrate through financial openness that they value their members' trust more than they value institutional control. These churches will be the ones that survive and thrive in the coming decades, because trust, once lost, is nearly impossible to rebuild. And churches that squander the trust of their members will discover that no amount of marketing, programming, or preaching can compensate for financial dysfunction. Where does your church's money go? If you cannot answer that question with specificity, you should be asking why. If your church refuses to provide detailed financial information, you should be asking what they are hiding. And if your church operates with minimal transparency and accountability, you should be asking whether your donations are being used in ways that honor both your sacrifice and the mission of the church. The money tells the story that leaders often try to conceal. It reveals what churches actually value, what they actually prioritize, and whether their actions align with their stated mission. Following the money is not an act of suspicion or distrust. It is an act of stewardship, because donors have both a right and a responsibility to know how their donations are being used. The financial crisis in American churches is not primarily about money. It is about integrity, accountability, and trust. And churches that fail to recognize this will pay a price far higher than any budget shortfall. The question is no longer whether churches can afford transparency. It's whether they can survive without it. Because faith built on secrecy never survives the light. If this matters to you, if you want to understand where church money actually goes and why financial transparency will determine which churches survive, subscribe. Because the institution that asks for your faith also asks for your money. And you deserve to know where both are going.